So this is our first ever sport pattern review, or how to bowl on a sport pattern. So today's pattern that we have is the 41-foot PBA Bear oil pattern. This is a pretty tough pattern, so if you can shoot 200 on this pattern, you're doing pretty good. Let's see, what are some important things to know about this pattern? Some would be that it's very flat. Obviously, 41 feet is another good one to know about it in the name. So some things you want to keep in mind is on flat patterns, you can't necessarily play the gutter unless you have certain things going on with your equipment, drillings, and so on. But I'll get into that a little bit later. Another important thing is to pay attention to the ratios, because that's what's going to tell you, what not to do. So this pattern is a 1 to 1.9. At least that's what the lane graph tells me. So what this means is it's going to be very flat from gutter to gutter, with very little taper, meaning oil in certain parts of the lane, a little bit less oil in other parts. So in order to have maximum success on this pattern, especially if you're bowling in league, is you want to break down a certain area and then move a little bit left to that area for breakdown. How you want to play this pattern is, if you don't get the opportunity to break it down and you're not seeing very much friction from the get-go, you want to try to be very straight. Now this doesn't mean you can play the second arrow and then throw it out to the first arrow. That means you have to play the second arrow and your break point needs to still be around the second arrow, called throwing it in front of you, meaning your angles are going to be very closed. Some of the shots that I throw in this video on the ball reaction standpoint, you're going to see me pretty straight, although it was already a little bit broken down because I bowled on it after league. But you'll see me loft it and give you a little decent idea of the angles you need to play at the very beginning. Now, as the pattern breaks down, it gets a little easier, but still it's pretty tough, because when you get into the middle part of the lane, you still don't really have any more oil or less oil. It's all the same because it's flat. So you have to create a little more of a wider launch angle going into the second arrow. So as you move further left, you still have to throw it a little bit further away from you, but you're not gonna throw it really far away from you. So you'll still have your angles pretty shallow, and you're gonna, the more you move left on this pattern, the more you're gonna throw it into the left side of the 6-pin. But for left-handers, you're gonna be throwing it into the right side of the 4-pin. Please tell me the camera's on. So a great way to get a good and fast start on this kind of pattern, with it being very flat, is you want to break down about the first and the second arrow. You want to oversurface a ball. Now you're not going to use this ball. This is a ball purely just to scrub some of the oil off on the lane. And what that means is you're going to dry out the front part of the lane, and you're going to dry up a little bit more of the down lane. That way your ball can get into a roll, which is very important on these flat patterns, because the back part of the lane is going to be hard to control on flat patterns because of how your ball reacts in the front part of the lane. So that is the reason for breaking down a little bit further right, and that way you give yourself something to throw into. That way it raises the ratio just a little bit and gives you a little better option of where to play. So being 41 feet, you want to have your break point, I'd say, as the most extreme far right, as about board 7. And you don't really need to have your break point in further than about 12 unless you're very, very far left and you're throwing the big banana hook. At least that's what I like to call it. So you generally want to keep your angles fairly closed on this pattern, especially when you're playing straight, because the flat part of the pattern doesn't really allow you to curve your ball a lot. when you're playing straighter, meaning if you kind of throw it towards the gutter, it's just going to stay out there, if not fall into it, because of how flat it is, and the oil is just overlaid on top of itself out there, and there's not really much give in this kind of pattern. So that's one thing you definitely want to keep in mind when you're starting the bowl on this pattern. Another addition to playing straight at first on this pattern, and then you'll slowly be able to move left and kind of curve your ball a little more, is you're generally going to need to stay up the back of the ball the whole time while bowling on this pattern. I noticed that even when I was really far left, though I was starting to come around the side of it a little bit more, it was still pretty up the back of it for getting more rotation. So I really went from really up the back of it to just slightly around it. So you're never going to really have to really get around it on this kind of pattern. Pattern.
Now, I know that's the most aggressive one.
In this video, I threw the Black Widow urethane, which normally you really wouldn't try to throw urethane on this one, but I oversurfaced it and was able to find a good look because of the center's topography on this certain lane surface. But one thing that I really saw that worked well with it was I was able to keep my angles right in front of me, and I was able to play a little bit straighter. Now I moved on to a phase 2, an axiom, a alpha crux once I really started to have to hook it, and then a GB3, well, game breaker 3, and then at the end an IQ tour. So I never really threw a really weak ball. I kept a symmetrical core in my hands outside of the Black Widow urethane and the alpha crux. The type of cores you want to have for this oil pattern are some pretty high flaring symmetricals. You don't really need an asymmetric ball unless you've moved really far left and you're starting to find that the symmetrical balls aren't quite hooking in the back part of the lane as much as you need them to be. So RGs and differentials, if you need you probably need a differential of 0.35 to and higher for your symmetrical balls. And you can use a variety of RGs, meaning you can go from 257 to something that's like on a high road, or you can go to something that's a 248. So a pretty early RG. So you have a little more play with your RGs and your differentials on this kind of pattern. I know that's a little nerdy, but those are some things you want to look for in the bowling balls that you bring. Now when it comes to your asymmetric pieces, generally you're not going to need something that's going to read extremely early. You want a little bit of a weaker asymmetric ball. Unless you're trying to go really straight. In that case, then it's okay to have a little bit of an earlier rolling ball. In addition to the symmetrical cores, one thing that I tried to keep was I wanted to have them all solid or hybrid covers. The pearlized balls tend to kind of wiggle on a pattern like this until it gets really dry, just because there's so much oil up in the front part of the lane. And you really have to get up the back of it if you're going to use a pearl ball and maybe put a little more surface on it. Some surfaces that I've found to be beneficial for this pattern was when I was first starting out and I really was trying to play the extreme outside, like for when I was just trying to dry it out to move left on and throw into it, was about 500 grit to 1,000 grit. When I was going for score, 1,000 grit seemed to do the trick on like the phase 2. And then when I needed something to be a little bit weaker as the pattern broke down, I moved into a 2,000 grit axiom as I started to get further left. And then on my alpha crux, when I really needed my ball to start to get down lane and hook down lane, that was like a 4,000 grit. but still on a solid cover stock to maintain a smooth shape overall. And the GB3 was about a 3000 and the IQ Tour was a 4000 grit, so it was a little shiny. Now, you don't need the shiny ball until it really gets dry. So the type of drillings you want to look for on this kind of pattern are pretty close to your positive axis point when you're trying to go up the lane. So you can have anywhere from like a 2.5 to about a 4-inch pin on your bowling balls that you're going to use a lot of surface on and that you're going to go pretty straight with, because those pin to pad distances will flare up a lot, get the ball started in the front part of the lane, but will retain a pretty smooth overall shape, allowing you to go up the lane on this pattern. When you move left, you want to go from a 4 to anywhere from a 4 to 5-inch pin, maybe a little longer than a 5-inch pin if you got a little bit slower ball speed. But generally you can keep it in that pin to distance range, because when you start moving left on this pattern, you go from needing your ball to read early to needing to get it pretty far down lane, but still retain a smooth breakpoint shape for when you start to really hook it on this pattern. Yeah, that was a cool. If you guys like the video, hit the like and subscribe button. If you got any video ideas you want to see or any bowling questions, leave it down in the comments. Thanks for watching.